Institutions, realist and liberal perspectives. Today we are going to talk about the three topics listed below.
There are three main levels of analysis. The systemic level emphasizes factors at the international level, which includes organizations across different regions. The domestic level emphasizes factors occurring at the state level, which includes organizations within the borders of a region. The individual level emphasizes factors amongst leaders, which includes but is not limited to the decisions of presidents and prime ministers.
Realist perspective. The realist perspective views the world in terms of the strong versus the weak. So what does this mean? In the realist perspective, there are two options: to maintain a balance of power or transition from one strong power to the next. A balance of power is maintained through the implementation of various alliances and the containment and equal distribution of power by counterbalancing. The second option is to preserve a state of hegemony with one major power, as America does in the international system today. Liberal perspective. The liberal perspective views the world in terms of building relationships and regular communication. So what does this mean exactly? The two key points of the liberal perspective is diplomacy and interdependence. Diplomacy is essentially the task of managing relations at any level of analysis. However, the liberal perspective places more emphasis on the international level in order to work towards a greater state of interdependence. Interdependence is a collective reliance of different entities at the international level through economic and political ties. Comparing the liberal and realist perspectives. Last move game theory. The last move game theory discusses war as an inevitable outcome, while the liberal perspective sees it as the outcome of failed interactions and a last resort. The realist perspective views the game theory as the general setting in which war is used as an instrument to avoid the dominance of another entity. Diplomacy. Realists use diplomacy as a means to project the force and/or power of state and non-state actors at the international level. The liberal perspective implements diplomacy with the goal of reducing the use of force and power. Change of power. The liberal perspective views any growth in power as natural and positive, because any growth can benefit all if maintained through a state of interdependence. Realists see a change in power as the catalyst for discord because it is distorting the balance of power or transitioning from one major power to another. Comparing the liberal and realist perspectives continued. Alliances. In terms of alliances, realists view them as tools necessary in counterbalancing and defeating opposing powers, but the alliances are based on different circumstances and are subject to change. The liberal perspective sees alliances as a means to further interdependence at the international level for the long run. Interdependence versus sovereignty. The realist perspective places an emphasis on sovereignty, which argues that states at the domestic level are entitled to absolute power over their own with no interference from outside forces. However, the liberal perspective exaggerates the need for an interconnected system between all levels, even if the right to sovereignty is not recognized at times. Liberal versus realist views on institutions. Political associations versus military alliances. One example to better represent this comparison is NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They are an alliance created initially by Western powers. Realists view this institution as a military alliance with the purpose to exert force or delay action depending on the situation. The liberal perspective views NATO as a political association with the purpose to further political and economic ties between nations. Power versus interdependence. Realists believe in using power through domestic institutions to back up their nation's positions in the international stage. The liberal perspective prefers power to be shared amongst nations instead of concentrating it all in one place. For example, while the liberal perspective might see the United Nations as increasing security by maintaining a collective body of power for the use of various international purposes, the realists perceive it as a deliberative body in regards to the exertion of power. State institutions versus international institutions. Realists favor intergovernmental organizations controlled by state institutions that are used to restrain the powers of international organizations. The global power groups are one example. They are composed of several great economic powers, with the goal to regain some control in the international system. The liberal perspective believes that IGOs lack credibility to work at the international level and use non-governmental organizations to exert power. One example is Global Witness, an NGO established with the purpose to fight human rights abuses across the world.
We hope you can now describe the different levels of analysis, the realist and liberal perspectives, and institutions in terms of the realist and liberal perspective.